email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Today's guest challenges a fundamental assumption many leaders still operate under, that people are primarily motivated by compensation, incentives, and career progression. Wes Adams has spent years studying what actually drives people at work, and the conclusion is clear. When work feels meaningful, performance improves. Teams collaborate better, people stay longer, and organizations become more resilient. He's the founder and CEO of SV Consulting Group, a positive psychology-based leadership development and organizational design firm. He's a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center, I love that name, and co-author of the best-selling book, Meaningful Work, How to Ignite Passion and Performance in Every Employee, which was named the Best Leadership Book of 2025 by Fast Company. And in the book, he breaks down the research behind purpose, belonging, and impact, and more importantly, what leaders can do to build those conditions inside their teams. What I really appreciate about Wes's work is that it moves this conversation out of the abstract and into execution. This isn't about inspiration. It's about how leaders design work in a way that actually drives results. Wes, I'm so excited to have you on the conversation.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
And I love bonding with another Atlanta guy, so this is great.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I don't know if you've listened to the podcast, but my first question is always the same. I like to think of all the people who come on the show as superheroes, and all superheroes have an origin story. So what's yours?
Mine is a little bit meandering as we were talking about.
Those are the best kind.
So I actually started my career in hospitality. So I spent about 10 years opening nightclubs, event space, restaurants in different parts of the country. And I really enjoyed that. And I actually learned a lot about operating a business doing that, because you have to do the administration of the business, but to be a good operator, you've got to be in there every day. You're meeting customers, you're adapting, you get feedback right away when things don't go well, and you have to adjust in the moment. And I just learned a lot about customer service and what it's like to interact with people there. And I eventually decided I wanted to do something that was a little bit more mission driven, and I left that and I started working for a consulting company called Purpose, which is based in New York, which it focuses on social impact and digital engagement. It was kind of one of the earlier companies doing large scale engagement through social media and things like that, which is really interesting for me, both from a learning about that digital engagement piece of it, but also starting to work with mission-driven organizations. And I think I sort of naively thought when I moved into that role that, I'm going to be working with people who are in mission-driven organizations, and so they're all going to be great places to work because everyone is focused on achieving the same outcome. And you're laughing because obviously that wasn't the case. And what I learned was that having a strong purpose was not enough to make somewhere a great place to work. Right? Some of them were, and some of them definitely were not, the companies that I collaborated with. And so I got really interested in understanding, what does it take to make a great place to work? What does it take to unlock people's potential, to create a workplace where people want to show up, do their best work, collaborate together? I also started working internationally at the same time. So I was working with folks in a number of different countries and learning about the fact that people have very different expectations of what work is about, what it should be like, how to interact. My colleagues in Brazil had a very different view on that than my colleagues in France and other places. So that was a big learning for me. And so I started diving into, Adam Grant and all of the organizational psychology, and eventually went to the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at Penn to understand kind of what it takes to create thriving teams and organizations.
So it's funny, I spent some time in Brazil, and I'm sure what you learned was the most important thing is the coffee break, which I always think is interesting because you go on the way back from lunch, you stop for coffee, and that's another 20 minutes. Like we just had it. What are you doing?
that collegial culture is so important. Actually, there's a funny story. I was working with a logistics company, and a global one, and they had one of their leaders from Germany go over to Brazil to, do some work over there. And, as is typical of, folks in German culture, very efficient, very focused, task oriented, like trying to focus on outcomes. And that did not go well in the Brazilian culture, because if you don't take time to get to know people and warm up, and so there was a big cultural adjustment that needed to happen there. And, I think that kind of goes to what I'm sure we'll talk about, but building community and the critical importance that has in doing work together.
Yeah, I think one of the people on my team was from the UK, and he was the leader of the group, and he'd only been there for a few months. And he said, I had to give up. He said, I tried to get them to, bring their lunch back to their desk and work. He said, it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, you can't swim against the current.
Not one that strong for sure. So one of the things we know that happens in communication is when you tell me something, a message you think is quite clear, I hear it through my biases, through the way that I define terms. So I think semantics matters. So as we lay the groundwork here, I want to start with some definition, if that's okay.
Great.
When you say meaningful work, what are we actually talking about in a business context?
Great question. So when I'm talking about meaningful work, I'm talking about work that has three important components, what we call the 3 C's: community, contribution, and challenge. Community is the belief that you belong in your organization. You can show up fully, bring your full self as much as you would like to, and your full ideas to the table. Contribution is understanding how your work positively impacts other people. This is where meaning and purpose often get confused. Purpose is having a goal. It's having something, that you are trying to work towards, hopefully in common with other people. And that's really great. It's really important. But meaning comes from seeing progress towards that purpose, right? You can have a purpose, not be making progress, and so because of that, not be doing or not feeling that your work is meaningful. This happens very often in mission-driven organizations where you have a very strong purpose, but you don't see how you're contributing to that. So contribution is seeing how your work is, laddering up to that larger organizational goal, or it could be how you're impacting the lives of customers, or even just contributing to your colleagues or the team. And finally, challenge is that individual opportunity to learn and grow and reach our full potential. And all three of these things combine to make work meaningful, to help us understand that our work actually matters. And they're all important. There's kind of a multiplier effect that happens among them, which also means if one of them is missing, it can cancel out the other two.
Yeah, I love the way you put it very succinctly. It's not enough that work not suck.
Yeah.
It's actually quite deeper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've all worked at places where we're just punching the clock, right, and taking the paycheck. And then we've worked at other places where we're excited to show up. We feel challenged. We feel like what we're doing actually matters. And those are the kind of places I want to work, and I want to help other people work.
So you study what makes work meaningful, but what's the moment that made it real for you? Was there like a single event that kind of triggered it for you? This is the thing that is important.
Oh, that's a great question. I think it was.
I only get one, so that's the one.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there was I mean, there have certainly been a number of very meaningful moments in my career. I think there was actually, this is going to sound very small, but when I was working at Purpose, we did a retreat with a number of members of the team, and the facilitator, who was really great, she did this exercise where she put an email up on the screen, and it was, a pretty brief email, but it was like directions for getting this project done from one colleague to another. And then she asked each person to talk about how they interpreted the email. And I was like, obviously, it was like very brief, to the point. I was like, this is great, and somebody else was like, oh, it's so rude. Like, I can't believe someone would write an email like that. And somebody else was like, it lacks context, and all of this stuff. And I was like, I would never have picked up on that, or at least at that point in my career. And I was like, wow, there are some really different perceptions happening here. And this is a really important thing that I need to be learning about if I'm going to be successful as a leader. And so I don't know, it was a very small thing, but it kind of unlocked this idea for me that about meeting people where they're at and having different perceptions of things, and that being a very important gateway to collaborating and helping people do their best work.
So that's actually why I think conversation is so important, because this email to at least the person who wrote it was crystal clear about what the intention was. And the example I always give is if I'm with somebody and they say, Clint, turn left. Well, to them, that's correct. That's very clear. It's left. It's not right. It's not forward, reverse. It's left. But I can go back and say, well, which left? Do you mean this driveway, the stop sign, the major intersection? I mean, which left do you want me to take? And so by asking these clarifying questions, so the person who thought it lacks context, they can get the context. And the person who thought it was rude, by having the conversation, you'll see the tone of voice and you realize it's not rude. So I think conversation is so important.
I agree with you 100%. And it's becoming more and more difficult as we're not in the same place. We're collaborating with colleagues in different parts of the world, different time zones. Yeah, it's a challenge.
It is a challenge. And I think this was a challenge pre-pandemic. I think the pandemic maybe exacerbated it by going remote. But I think people have this burning desire to want to do one-way communication because, look, I want to check this off my to-do list. I want to get it done so I don't have to
feels easier.
I can move on. My best, so maybe I'm being a bit negative here, but I think what happens is if I send you an email that it's done or I post something on Slack or Jira, then I could check it off my list. And what I hope is you never see it and never call me about it. But if I actually picked up the phone and had a conversation with you, I might learn it's not done. And now I got to put it back on my to-do list. So it's interesting.
You know, I think that a big part of that is the fact that most of us are overwhelmed. We have too many things on our to-do list. And we just want to check those off so that they're out of our heads. And when it comes back, when we have to have a conversation about it, I know I feel this way. I'm like, oh, I got to move on to the other things. Like I can't spend all this time explaining to you what I mean when actually that in many cases is a productive use of time.
It absolutely is. You know, one of the things I think is interesting is some people take the term meaningful work and they think it's something that's abstract or nice to have, but really it's a performance driver, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of research, not only my own with my colleagues, but many decades of research shows that the belief that your work matters is the upstream factor that drives all of the outcomes that we're looking for, not just individually, you know, job satisfaction and our own internal motivation, but for teams and organizations, it drives creativity, innovation, productivity, performance, resilience, and adaptability. Within the last few years, there's been some really great, very extensive research from Oxford showing that the elements of meaning drive profitability and stock price. So as we're thinking about driving performance in our organizations, this is a really big, critical leadership lever.
What a concept, be able to drive performance while having happy employees. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'd like to jump in there because I want to highlight the difference between happy and meaningful, right? Which are two very different things. And I think what I'm advocating for is not that we make everyone happy. I think, in fact, some of the most meaningful moments that we have are difficult moments. I ask everybody when I'm doing a workshop or working with a new client, I almost always open by asking people to share some of their most meaningful moments at work. You know, like, can you think about a time that you're particularly proud of or something that really stands out to you as very meaningful in work that you've done? And I would say, and this is my unofficial count here, but I would say more than 80% of the time, people talk about something that was really hard, where they struggled, they didn't know if they could do it, and they ended up achieving something that they didn't think was possible, or they came through something together with a group of people because they were able to collaborate. And so I wouldn't say that those were happy experiences where people were feeling joyful necessarily, but they were certainly meaningful experiences. So that's not to say people shouldn't feel joy and be happy at work, which I, of course, encourage. But I just want to make the distinction that that's not what I'm focused on.
Yeah, you made that distinction in the book now that I think about it, because you said that you could have parties and you could do things to keep them happy, but that doesn't really make it meaningful work.
Yeah,
so,
ping pong tables don't get you meaningful work. Yeah.
It makes you excited to go to work, but it doesn't get meaningful work.
They lose their luster pretty quickly.
They do.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really found interesting was, let me ask the question, but it's a leading question. So can meaningful work exist in any role, or are some jobs inherently more meaningful than others?
Great question. And what we found in our research was that any job, any day can be meaningful, especially if you have a great leader who's helping you see that meaning. So, we talk to people that work in nonprofit, like very commonly people are like, oh, meaningful work, you mean nonprofit work, or you mean working in healthcare. And those certainly are jobs that have a high potential to be meaningful. But we interviewed, thousands of people, and we talked to hairstylists, we talked to janitors, we talked to people in construction, all different types of industries. And there are very powerful opportunities to find meaning in all of those jobs if you know where to look.
Well, I thought it was an interesting quote. Somebody interviewed a janitor at NASA, and they said, what are you doing? And he says, putting people on the moon. I mean, so that's
powerful. The JFK story. Yeah.
Is that what that was? Okay.
Yeah.
But what a great story. I mean, and I remember in my career meeting people who just wash windows in the office building and chatting with them, and what they found their work meaningful as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, your job doesn't have to be your life's calling for your work to feel worthwhile.
So you identified the three key pillars, the 3 C's as you call them. And you said they kind of have a multiplier effect. First starting out, is there one you should focus on first, or you have to do them all in parallel, or what does that look like?
I think my thinking on that has evolved a bit in the last couple of years. I think that community is actually a really important foundation for some of the other things that happen. And one of the reasons is the psychological safety that comes with feeling like you can show up authentically and that you're a part of the group is something that allows you to bring your best ideas to the table and can potentially unlock some of the other things that happen in contribution and challenge. And I think it's also, there's, as I'm sure you're aware, a pretty significant loneliness epidemic in the US in particular, but elsewhere, people are no longer in the same rooms with each other a lot of the time, and we feel very separated, and work has become, in many cases, very transactional, and people are really craving for it to be more than that. And so I think it's actually something that deserves some extra attention in this moment.
Yeah, I was going to get to this later, but now is probably a good time to talk about it. So, you mentioned in the book a Harvard study that found authentic relationships with others don't only predict health and happiness, but also job satisfaction, professional achievement, and financial success. But then you go on to say what you kind of just said, which is the traditional sources of community have kind of eroded over the years, placing more emphasis on the workplace to find those connections with others. And this is only made more difficult by the remote or virtual work. So as a leader, how can I help make those quality connections?
Really being intentional about that and carving out time for it. So I think there are a few things when I'm working with teams to talk about this, and especially leaders, and build the skills of creating community. One of the biggest things that came up in our research, one of the biggest indicators in the measurement that we put together, was how people responded to the question, my leader cares what's happening in my life outside of work, right? Not just knows, but cares, right? And so if we are taking the time to ask people what's happening in their lives, and we're genuinely curious about that and investing some time and getting to know, what they care about and what their family is like and what else is important to them, that's a really solid starting point. And so often we forget to do that just because we're busy, or because we're not in the same room, or, we jump on a Zoom call, we go from one to the next without taking any break in between. And we're like, okay, let's get down to business. What's the agenda? And we don't take that time. Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General of the U.S. previously and is one of the folks who has studied the loneliness epidemic in the U.S., he instituted a practice in his organization where people would, at each weekly team meeting, each person would get 5 minutes and they would bring in an object or show a picture or something like that that was meaningful to them and talk a little bit about it. Like, here's this scarf that I keep around that my grandmother actually knitted for me. And like, I used to, spend time with her as a kid, and it's meaningful to me because it reminds me of, the things that we did together, et cetera. And it was a way to invite people to bring a piece of themselves into the conversation. And what he found doing that was not only did people kind of find connections with each other that they hadn't already known about, but it really facilitated cross-functional collaboration because people had developed more than just a transactional relationship with their colleagues. They felt like it was okay to pick up the phone because they knew them a little bit more, and really facilitated all of the other work. So I think these are small things. They're small investments, the small signals that we send to each other throughout the day that add up to something really big.
And to be clear, it was just one person per meeting, right?
Well, yeah. Yes, just one person, but it would rotate each week.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I just come off of a long 4.5-year project, and one of the one of the interesting things for me was it was a mix of scientific people and marketing people. And so, and I'm an engineer, so I totally got the engineers and the scientists who are like, let's go. The meeting's 1 minute old, let's go. And then the marketing person who I dearly love, she would say, oh, well, how was your weekend? And I know that sometimes that causes friction on the other side because they just want to go because they're so busy. But I do find that helped us establish relationships better. It wasn't just about the work. It was also about showing, and she genuinely cared. It wasn't just a throwaway question. She really cared what was going on. And it helped us, I think, bond as a team. So when she left the project, I'm going to channel my inner her name. And I would start asking these questions to make sure we still had that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And, I get like sometimes it can feel forced, and, people always complain about, we're going to have some like forced icebreakers or interaction or whatever. It doesn't have to happen at the beginning of every meeting. There are a lot of different ways to do it. You could choose to do that outside of the meetings. You could make sure you have in-person retreats or, some other opportunities for people to get to know each other. It's just important that you have intentionally thought about that and designed it into the process of working, however fits with your organization.
And for us, it was important because we were working with global teams. And so we were in the US, but the teams were all over Asia and Africa and Egypt. I mean, literally worldwide. And so you'd only meet with these people once every 2 or 3 weeks for an hour. And so you kind of did need to take that time just to say, hey, how are you? How are you doing? What's going on? I heard about this in your world. Is everything okay? And I think that was helpful to establish the bonds because you don't see those people very often. So,
yeah. You have to design it in. I think this is stuff that we don't put on our calendars, and we need to think about actually how are we making time. I live and die by my calendar. If it's not on my calendar, I'm not doing it. And I've started scheduling little blocks for this, and you still be flexible, move it around, whatever, but by putting it on my calendar, that signifies to me that it's important and it's worth some of my time, and I need to be paying attention to it.
Yeah. Another thing that you wrote so it's all about me. It's all about what resonates with me. Another thing that you wrote was that's been a kind of a pet peeve of mine is you see people who put these mission statements or their philosophies up on the wall, but then nobody actually follows them, right? So you talk about, so what I want to ask you is, how does purpose show up at the team level and not just on the company wall or mission statement?
This is the quickest way to kill meaning, is to say one thing and do another, right? You have this grand mission statement and the values that we abide by. And then there's a misalignment in the way that leaders behave, or the way that processes or compensation is designed, the way that we incentivize behaviors in an organization doesn't align with those values. And that alignment, it doesn't add a lot to meaning. It's not like super meaningful for things to be aligned, but it's the quickest way to destroy it. It's sort of a baseline. We actually talk about that as a prerequisite for the 3 C's. It's not even included in the 3 C's. It's like before you get there, you need to make sure that you're paying attention to alignment. And that's not to say that like you have to be perfect every time, because none of us are,
right.
But it's really important to be honest and authentic about the things that you're saying you believe in. And that, shows up in how leaders are behaving as well as what we're rewarding within the company.
And I think you mentioned also later on in the book, but basically if you make a mistake, let's say you didn't follow the rule, or that you did have misalignment, it's okay to come back and say, hey, you know what, that was a mistake on my part, and going
Absolutely.
forward, we're going to do this.
Yeah. And I don't believe in cancel culture, right? Like we should allow people to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, because we all do it. And as we're working towards living some of these values, some of them are aspirational and we need to grow into them, and that should be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I quick aside, I think that I'm glad I didn't grow up today, because I think back growing up in rural South Carolina, some of the things I did before social media was around, and that's back when you can make a mistake and they let you fix it. Nowadays, it's 16-year-olds. If you make a mistake, they want to prosecute you to the fullest extent. And I feel like we don't have time as kids to grow up, but that's another story.
It's tough. I mean, it's, I would say like in many cases, it's not a very psychologically safe culture. Like if you make a mistake, there's a real fear of retaliation. There's not a learning and development culture in parts of the world. And that makes it hard to have in our companies and our organizations. So we have to make extra effort to create that space if we want to be successful.
We do. Absolutely do. So you quote Zach Mercurio in the book, who I'm interviewing in a few weeks, by the way, on his book.
Oh, amazing. Zach is one of my favorite people. Also, my research partner on a lot of this stuff, and just like one of the best human beings I think I've ever met.
I look forward to that. We're going to talk about his book, The Power of Mattering.
Great.
But in your book, you talk about, I guess his suggestion of regularly telling people, quote, if it wasn't for you, end quote, and then describe what the contribution that they made. And that's such a simple act, but I think as a recipient of that, it has such a profound impact, because it goes back to one of your 3 C's, but it shows that I matter.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would say this falls into the contribution bucket, right? This is how what you're doing is meaningful to me or to the team. There's a whole chapter in the book on positive feedback, which is, I think, one of the highest leverage and most underused leadership skills there is. It is, and I think we write about this in the book. So there was a few years ago research from Gallup and WorkHuman showing that one thank you once a week from a manager cut disengagement and burnout in half. Right? That's one thank you once a week, and less than 40% of the people in that study felt adequately recognized for the work that they were doing. Right? We're very focused on fixing what's wrong, and we very often forget to acknowledge what's going well. And I know we didn't talk about this at the beginning, but positive psychology, which is what I study and research in my background, is very focused on understanding what are the practices, the mindsets, the behaviors that help us do our best work and live our best lives. So if we think about traditional psychology as, usually people think about clinical psychology and focusing on things like depression or anxiety, PTSD, super important, right? And that's work that needs to be done. Like we need to clear those roadblocks. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but if we're completely successful at that, if we absolutely clear those roadblocks, that just gets us to neutral, right? And that's not what we're after. That's not what we're looking for in our lives. We want to work towards great. We want happy, productive, fulfilled lives. We want to thrive. And so to get there, we have to focus on the things that move us above the line, not just fix problems. And we have to do that at work also. If we're only fixing problems, if we're only giving people corrective feedback or constructive feedback, we're not telling them how to succeed. We're only telling them how to not fail.
Yeah. And you talked earlier about people who are busy, but how much time does that take just to say thank you? I mean, that's so quick and easy. You have to be sincere, right? I mean, you can't just, like you said earlier, you can't just throw it out there. It's got to have some sincerity behind it. But certainly you can find something in a team member's work product to say thank you for.
Absolutely. And it's about making it a practice, just like anything else. But of course, you people can tell if you're insincere about things. But I guarantee you that there are things that everybody on your team has done this week. There's something that each of them have done that has added value, and calling that out doesn't mean you can't talk about some things that need to be changed also, but it helps them know what they're doing well. It shows appreciation, and it gives them a roadmap for how to do more of that. They know what's going well. They know what to do more of next time. And that's the quickest way to getting to high performance.
It's funny to me how some people just can't grasp that. I dealt with one person at a company where I was doing a training for him, and he called me in at lunch, and he just says, he literally rolled his eyes and he goes, well, you're really good at your job, right? Shaking his head. Like, you're saying that in a way that's not positive. And I don't understand. Shouldn't it be good for you that I'm good at my job at teaching the class? I mean, and it was just weird. He had that attitude on the whole 2 days I was there. So it was, I don't know why some people just can't. It's like it makes them smaller by saying thank you. I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think not all of us had great role models. Not all of us worked for people that were good at that or knew how to do that well, or even had parents that were good at that. And so if we never had a model for that, it's very hard to figure out how to do that. And it takes some work, not just adopting that practice, but going back and thinking about our mindsets and what we learned and how to unlearn and change our mind about some of those things.
Let's hope he can do that.
Yeah.
So one of the C's is challenge, which, can be scary sometimes because you're pushing yourself. But then you mentioned how Robert Quinn, who's a professor at Michigan, describes helping them, which I love this visual, by having one hand on their back, pushing them to be the best version of themselves, while the other hand is under their arm, supporting them through the hard parts. I mean, what a great visual that is.
I also love that. And I quote him very often on this front. I think we remember the push, the idea of like pushing people out of the nest and hoping that they fly, but we often forget that other hand under the arm. And that's what it takes to be successful, or to help others be successful, is seeing those opportunities for them, giving them stretch assignments, pushing them outside of their comfort zone, but making sure that they have the resources and support to be successful. I call this achievable challenge. Right? We don't want to stretch somebody so far that it's not possible, because that's actually going to have a negative outcome both for the business and that person. We want to, as much as we can, set people up for success. And that doesn't mean not letting them struggle, because struggle is what creates growth and meaning in many cases. But it does mean making sure that there's a bit of a safety net there.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think some of the biggest things I've accomplished, kind of what you said earlier, is when somebody pushed me and I was like, I'm not ready for that. And they said, yes, you are. You're ready. We're going to make you, just going to go do it. We're going to make you do it. And was it the best experience ever? No, but I got better, and it was adequate first time out. So,
yeah. And probably you really didn't want to let that person down, right? You worked really hard to make sure that you were able to achieve that person's expectations of you.
Absolutely. So how does meaningful work influence trust and collaboration within teams? Because I do a lot of work with teams, and I'm curious about that dynamic.
I think that trust is actually I think about it as part of building community, building those relationships with other folks. And I would say like some of the elements of building trust, like showing authenticity and vulnerability, and, like being transparent about who you really are, not having an agenda, showing competence, which is really easy to do when you're able to show the impact of the work, the contribution of the work. I would say they're pretty closely related.
And I always think accountability is important, and teamwork. And so I've written 2 books. My third one's going to be called Your Best Ability is Accountability. But
I like that.
So what happens to accountability when people feel their work actually matters?
I think there's just a higher bar for holding ourselves and other people accountable, because we all agree that we're not just punching the clock. It's something that matters. It's something that's making a difference. Even if that's a small difference to someone on our team, there's more of I would say, an internal motivation to make sure that thing happens, or to make sure that we're clear about when it's not going to happen. How can we adapt, adjust as needed to continue to move forward productively?
Early in the book, you were talking about Astro Teller, who is the CEO of X's, I think it's called the Google Moonshot team or group or whatever that is. And he had a quote that, of course, resonated with me again, because as a project manager, I always want to get the bad news as fast as possible. But he says, if there's an Achilles heel on one of our projects, we want to know how, or we want to know now up front, not way down the road. And, of course, this is difficult because people don't like to deliver bad news. And I think there's also, we have this hope we can fix it before I have to tell anybody. So how can we get people to share bad news early?
I think we can encourage it. We can role model it ourselves. And when people do it, thank them for doing it, and not punish them for doing it. Because it's kind of at the core of psychological safety, right? If people feel like there's going to be a retaliation, or they might get punished or lose their job for sharing the news, they're gonna hide it as long as possible or avoid it. If it's just a normal part of doing the job, we know that everybody's going to make mistakes and fail, and they can be learning opportunities. People are much more likely to bring it to the table. I think Teller and Google X go like an extra step by actually rewarding failure. They bonus people when they close projects,
right?
Because they want to incentivize people to look for ways that this isn't going to work and shut them down before they invest too much time and money in these big, wild ideas, right? And that isn't something that every business is going to do. But I think it's a great example of an incentive structure. We were talking about alignment earlier, an incentive structure that's very aligned with their values. They're incentivizing people to close down a big project so that they're not wasting time. And they throw a party, and then they send everybody a check.
That's quite the incentive to try to break it early, right? So I do some work in the semiconductor space, and these are 14-month projects with 20 to 40 engineers, which highly paid people. And we actually count as a win if we kill a project early. It's better to kill it in the first month than to spend 12 months on it and then realize this is not going to be successful when you've wasted all that time and all those resources. So I get the whole idea about kill early.
Yeah, and the way that things are going, we have to be more adaptable, more willing to change our minds and adjust to an environment that every day is changing really significantly. I don't know how you guys are using AI, but even just within the last 4 to 6 weeks, the way that it's transformed my business and the way that I'm using it to do things that I didn't think I could use it for, and changing my mind about what that means for how I'm designing leadership programming and how I'm thinking about how organizations are structured. I'm having to go back and completely rethink everything I thought I knew and studied, and that's exciting, but it's also really hard. It's really hard to be like, oh, that thing that I'm an expert in this area, and that relies on, my expert status is based on me knowing how to do something in a certain environment. And that's not actually true anymore.
I think you're still the expert. I'd still trust your answers more than something.
I really appreciate that. And I think when people get too confident that they know how to do something, that's what causes us to kind of solidify our thinking, right? And I hope to always be learning and relearning and unlearning.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I have a colleague who I like a lot, and we would have conversations, and he actually changed my mind on something. It was about, I won't go into it because it's political, but anyway, he changed my mind on something. And then later, I came back and said, hey, you know what, I observed what you were talking about, and I think you're right. So a few weeks later, I brought up another topic, and I was making my point, and he just wasn't hearing it. And I said, why don't I changed my mind. Why won't you change yours? He goes, because I know I'm right. I said, then we can't have deep conversations anymore because you're not ever going to change your mind. So what's the point?
Yeah. That's tough. We certainly could get into a much deeper conversation about some of the challenges that we currently have, with our ability to have a real discussion about things and be open-minded. But yeah, I think, one of the other things that I'm seeing is how companies are really, my clients are really focused on the human skills, right? Like with everything that's happening in AI and the uncertainty and the way that markets are changing and work processes are changing, the things that make us most human, our creativity, innovation, adaptability, our ability to have empathy, think strategically, critically, make tough decisions, think about risk. These are the things that are becoming more and more valuable as AI can do, first of all, a lot of the repetitive tasks, but also it's very easy to just jump on Claude and become a subject matter expert in 5 minutes on anything that you want, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that those things also align very well. These human skills align very well with this idea of meaningful work, because these are our highest human skills. They take a lot of our energy, a lot of our focus, and we're not going to exercise those things unless we believe that our work actually matters. You can't punch the clock and be innovative, and you can't just show up and be empathetic or think strategically.
Well, that concludes part 1 of my conversation with Wes Adams, founder and CEO of SV Consulting Group and co-author of Meaningful Work. Coming up in part 2, Wes discusses why the rules of improv are a good basis for team collaboration and leadership.
Improv is, sort of grounded in this yes and mindset, right? When your scene partner or somebody else in the group says something or leans into a character, the sort of core rule of improv is you never push back against that. You build on it. You say yes to what that person is doing, and you add your own elements to that. And I think there's when we're talking about how to collaborate as a team, that's a really important concept to lean into. Very often we look for ways to shut people down. You'll say something, I'll be like, I don't really think that what you said about trust is true, and that is not really going to encourage you to continue bringing good ideas to the table.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.